And one of the things that came up, I think, a little bit earlier, I think, still on the slides.
Need to back up.
Yeah. So just thinking through the agenda, this came up when we were talking at the beginning of the meeting with Glenn Weber. You'll hear this throughout the meeting. I think it's unlikely that there are people out there without unconscious biases. It's human nature. It goes back to the earliest, whether it be cave person day or wherever you want to go back to, and it was intended to protect you. You would see something, you would judge it a threat or an opportunity, and you'd react in that manner. So we all have them. It's unlikely you're ever going to eliminate them. The goal of tonight is to make you more aware of them, to be aware of the impact they have on us, and to therefore try to mitigate or at least reduce their influence on your decision making. So it's not to pretend that it's going to go away. It won't. It's part of who you are, but rather learn that it's there and somehow remove it from some of your decision making. We'll go through biases, the unconscious and the conscious. It's a 95-5 split. I think Pat's doing that slide. Microaggressions are little things that to some degree, maybe that was that me getting out of going first. It's comments that you may not even realize you're making, but it's demeaning to someone else. And then Pat put this together. I think it's a lot of fun, a kind of a gamified version of what's been done on earlier versions of this to help you think through things and how you would handle situations. Next slide. So before we go to the slide that has the 8 questions, there is no intent that you answer these aloud. I will go back to Jess's comment. We are recording the first portion of this. If you want to speak up, that's fine. Just recognize that it will be memorialized. And that's why the second half is going to be more open-ended, where whatever you say certainly will be heard by the participants, but not recorded. But as you look at the next slide at the 8 questions, and I'll read 1 or 2, but the intent is not that I read all of them. You can go to the next slide, please. Think about some of these. You will have done some of them. In fact, I'll give an example for myself. How often do you specify someone's race when it is not necessarily relevant? For instance, you say a Black doctor or a Latina doctor or a white lawyer. A Latina lawyer. My example is that my wife and I tend to say, oh, we saw a Chinese woman. Now, our son-in-law is Chinese. And to me, it was describing the person, it was helping identify them. And my daughter on the side said, Dad, that's racist. So why is it racist? I'm just helping you understand. And there are two ways to look at it. If I say a woman who's Chinese or a Chinese woman, and there's no need to say it, that's when it's racism. If there is somebody that I'm trying to point out to you and they're in a group where they look different, then I might say the woman with Asian characteristics or something, if I'm helping you find them. So it comes back to, do I need to characterize them that way, or am I using it because unconsciously I'm putting them into a category? So read through the rest of them. I won't, but take another minute and then just recognize how they influence what you're doing and how you decide. And if none of them resonate, you're not being honest. And I think we can probably go on at that point.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that we really shouldn't blame ourselves if we said yes to any of these questions. I know I have answered a couple of them yes. As Ed said earlier, these are biases that are formed throughout our lives. They're just, the societal messages that we've gotten throughout our lives. Okay. So there really are 2 kinds of biases that we wanted to point out: conscious or explicit bias and unconscious or implicit bias. Conscious bias accounts for prejudices that we are actually aware of, whereas the unconscious biases refer to judgments that it really exist outside of our awareness and to some extent are outside of our control, but we're going to talk about how to mitigate them and how to get some control over those. But unconscious bias is really a term that's used to describe the stereotypes that we have of people or attitudes that we have about them. So they impact our thoughts because they are kind of the first thing that pops into our heads. And an interesting example of this, and I'm sure those of you who live in the Philadelphia area will remember this story of the Starbucks in Rittenhouse Square, where there were two men of color, two Black men, who were there to meet a colleague. They weren't buying a beverage. They were just there for a business meeting. How many times has that happened before? Many, many times. But they were waiting a long time and they asked to use the restroom. And they were refused because they weren't customers. They said, this is for customers only. It escalated and the store manager ended up calling the police. The police came. They didn't arrest the people, the two men, but they did ask them to leave the store. And as a result, Starbucks shut down all their stores, and they did what? Unconscious bias training for everybody. If anybody knows the outcome of that, I'd be interested to know, but I'd be surprised if it had much impact at all.
So I'll throw in one other example, and this is for you golfers out there, but a lot of times somebody will say, oh, you hit like a girl, or things like that, which is back to microaggression and somewhere in the unconscious bias. But it can, much like many of these things, it can go two different ways. If you're a golfer, have you ever said, or have you heard the term nice putt, Alice, when somebody leaves the putt short? If you're a golfer, you may know the rest of the story, but when I first heard that, Alice was ALICE. It was some guy that didn't hit putt firmly enough to get it to the hole. The origin of the story is actually completely different. There's a British professional golfer and broadcaster, Peter Alliss, ALLISS, and he was the first one who said, nice putt, Alice. He was actually talking to himself for leaving it short. And it kind of took on a life of its own. So that's one of those, you shouldn't be making a comment like you putt like a girl, but you should also realize that maybe that's not what the person was saying. So it's where it gets so tricky. You have to really think about what's being said, what's behind it. And the best thing to do is just explore. Gee, why did you say that? Oh, I love Peter Alliss, and that was what he said when he left it short. Or, well, you left it short. That's like a girl. Well, does that feel right? There's some pretty good female golfers out there. So part of what Pat and I are going to emphasize, this is to lead to discussion. It's not to get rid of your unconscious bias. It's to make you aware of it and to lead discussion. And actually, that opens up some very nice networking with people rather than being hostile, but exploring why they've said something or why they're thinking a certain way.
And John just gave us a nice example too. We had an example here at the mall. Two kids were fighting and the police came. They pushed the Black kid to the floor and sat the one they perceived as white, he was Latino, on a couch. It led to a lawsuit and a settlement. Interesting story. Thank you, John. Appreciate that.
And apparently that it was the Latino who was the aggressor, as it turned out, as well.
Interesting. But his skin was lighter. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Take a quick look at sort of the brain science behind our conscious and unconscious biases. So there's a man named Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, behavioral economist. And he talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking, where system 1 operates automatically and very quickly. Little or no effort is involved on our part. It's almost an involuntary reaction. And that accounts for a whopping 95% of our thinking. And that's where unconscious bias often resides. So we are very quick to hit that unconscious bias button. And those influence our judgment and our decisions without us really having conscious control over them. But system 2 is a slower, more proactive way of thinking. It's much more deliberate, and it requires effort. We have to analyze some information. We have to look at the facts. So we can use that to identify and mitigate the influence of our system 1 biases. So really, The mitigation comes from just slowing down, consciously evaluating our judgments, and in that way, hopefully make fairer and more objective judgments. So here's an example of how that might play out in an unconscious bias. Let's say you're interviewing a candidate with a strong resume, but a very heavy accent. Your system one thinking might unconsciously associate the accent with a lack of communication skills. That's an unconscious bias. But your system two can intervene. So by reflecting on the individual, their qualifications for the job, the answers that they're giving to you, rather than on their accent, you can make a more objective decision about that candidate.
So this is a mini audience participation. Keep in mind the recording, so go as you're willing. But if you were facing a problem like this, how would you react to it? And I think you have to look through two aspects of it. Is it a matter of you just listening more carefully? Is it a matter of perhaps helping a little bit, just being more patient with the person? Will it actually be disruptive to the team? Who are they going to work with? One of the things that I saw at Merck, it was prevalent in research. We had a lot of people of Asian ancestry who were in research, and it could be very hard to understand them, but a lot of the folks they worked with spoke the same language they did. So now I have to think about, is it just a little bit hard for me, but the team will have zero issue with it? Is it going to impact the performance of the team? How strong is the person? And you have to avoid going the other way. Am I going to hire them because I fear that I am discounting them because it's hard to communicate, but maybe the other person is as good and the communications are easier? So it gets twisted into a lot of things. I'm curious if any of you have an example, something you've been through at work that you would point out and how it was resolved.
I had someone who I interviewed who had a thick accent. She was from Taiwan. But I felt she was a very good candidate, and hired her. And I continually had to deal with my boss saying, "Oh, she's so hard to understand." And I was coaching her on her writing, helping her, become more effective in writing. He'd comment how, "Oh, she writes so well, but I have such trouble understanding her." And I had to fight to get her a promotion because of his attitude.
Great example, John.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think, and this was implied during Pat's conversation, but the unconscious bias, it originates in system one. You have a hard time understanding them. Maybe you immediately don't necessarily want to work with them, or it just shifts them down in terms of how you're ranking people. But that's where you get back into system two. And then think about it, and doesn't mean you should always accept them, but it means that you shouldn't reject them based on that initial reaction. You really want to look at the impact on the team, the challenges, and mitigation. So don't choose them because of it. Don't not choose them because of it, but be aware of it, and then hopefully make better decisions, as John did, and hopefully have a boss that won't be so hard to convince.
Now,
Was she ultimately successful, John?
Yes, she was very good. She worked for me for a long time. She did a great job. And everyone else saw it. It was just getting my boss to see it. But the other thing that strikes me in this is, even if I have this first reaction, that's at that emotional level. And so even when I take the deliberative thinking about it, that helps me get past it, how do I overcome that emotional reaction that I still probably have internally that's kind of shaping my overall impression?
If it's okay, Pat, I'll go first.
Go ahead.
So what I would say, John, we're back to the initial comments. I don't think you can eliminate it. I just think it's part of who you are. It's a natural thing. It's a protective measure. What you have to do is then step back from it and realize that it is influencing how you think, and then do your best to get it down into more quantifiable or practical aspects. And also coming back to maybe the person's much better, but the team is not going to be able to work well with them. If that's the case, then maybe you're hurting your business, and now you still have to go back. Is it a matter of a day's training and everybody thinking about it and it'll work fine? Or is it really going to impact your team? And at that point, perhaps what you do is you try to help the person, but you don't necessarily bring them on board. But it all comes back to recognizing something that's an inevitable part of how we view the world, but trying to let it know. In the past, perhaps you would have just said, we can't hire the person. I can't understand them. Now you're more deliberatively going through why you aren't and how else you should look at the situation and what's the difficulty associated with the mitigation.
Good answer. I have nothing to add.
Thanks, Pat. So next slide, I think.
Yep.
So we talked a little bit about the microaggressions. They're back to things that you don't intend, that you're probably not even fully aware. Our little scenario at the beginning, maybe under my breath, is like a typical woman. Well, that's not right. And the person probably hears it, but it's a natural reaction. I think we're back to, if you're being honest, you've done that at some point, maybe not that phrase, but something else, because it's back into how we're wired. And yes, those are things that you should try to reduce. You're still probably not going to fully eliminate them. It's going to be something. It's just what goes through. The secret to this whole thing is saying, you know what? That was a microaggression. That was not right. I need to remove that from my equation. So yeah, that ideal world, we get rid of it. I think Pat and I, and maybe some others, were talking about a belief that today's probably Gen Y and younger may be a lot better with these things. But I honestly don't know the answer. I could go back to that, our open discussion at the end of this. I think they're exposed to so much more. I think there's a good possibility that mutes some of that effect. Or maybe they've learned to be politically correct. So I don't know quite the answer, but I know that in my own heart, if I look at my own daughters, they're the ones telling me and calling me on these different things. So I think they're at least more aware of it and potentially less affected by it. And Pat, you may have an additional comment, but then we'll call up the video, which to me is one of the more powerful ones.
Yeah, it is powerful. And the woman in this video is probably around the age of one of your daughters, is my guess. So it's interesting. I think you'll find it interesting to see how she reacts to it. Roll the tape, as they used to say. So glad Jess is here doing this. This is why I didn't want to do it. If I knew I'd screw it up.
You see, that's like ladies first. That's like tech-savvy youth, right?
Yep.
Which gets back into the unconscious biases.
That's right. That's right.
And Jess is going, much as my wife being led into that awkward situation, she's going, just because I'm young doesn't mean that I need to be the one that's dealing with this.
We need a 10-year-old child to do this. Yeah.
Jess, is there something in the Zoom settings? Is that where it is? Not the YouTube?
I'm trying to find it. It worked earlier, if you can believe that.
I do believe
Easily.
that.
Well, Ed and Pat, can't you act it out?
If we were in the same room, absolutely, but without that. If not, if it doesn't work this time, let's just watch the captions, then Pat and I can dub in.
Okay, let me give it one more shot.
Okay. I think you got it this time.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm Shasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American.
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Governor, so listen. Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap, beware Jack the Ripper. Bloody hell. Hip hip, cheerio. I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
I think it's an amazing little video. It
Pheasants.
impacted a lot of people.
Fingers and mesh.
It's worth
But
watching again.
One of the things I remember is Larry Badler saying that impacted me as much as anything. And if I used my son-in-law's actual example, he was born in China and he was a year or two old when he left China. He went to live in London and then he went to live in the US. And he has zero accent. He has Asian features. He has Chinese features. When he goes out, is called Chink, and he is associated with China. And then, of course, when we had COVID and some of the potential origins in Chinese labs, he was facing hatred. That's not only impactful to my wife and I and our daughter, but we have 2 grandchildren now who have a mix of features. So you just think about something like that. This is a person who's as American as I am, but because of features, he is judged entirely differently. So I think the video is powerful on that. Any of you have an example you want to share?
We have a niece who was adopted from China, and at before her first birthday, I think. And her parent, they live out in Berkeley, but her parents are always nervous about how she's perceived and how is that going to be difficult for her.
It's a shame.
Yeah, Ed, I'm just curious about, and it kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier in terms of distinguishing between what might be viewed as unconscious bias and the same statement might not be, in terms of identifying somebody by the way they look. I truly am curious about somebody's background when I hear an accent or something. I'd like to know what their culture is like, or where they come from, or things like that. Where is the line there in terms of showing interest in somebody who might be proud to be able to talk about their culture versus maybe diminishing them or making them feel that way?
I think I'm going to channel a little bit the person who originally put together the whole presentation. But what I would say is curiosity is fine if the other person is willing to entertain that. And I think you right off the bat need to be respectful of that. Perhaps you share something about yourself. You don't presume anything about who they are, what they are, or because they're Asian, they probably do math well or science well. You have to eliminate all of those pieces of it. But to say, I actually have never traveled that much in Asia, but it's an area that fascinates me, obviously goes back earlier than other cultures. Do you have much contact with your origins there? Would you mind talking about it? It's a very fine line. You have to, in fact, I'm going to switch to something and then see if Pat wants to answer additionally. But one of the things that my mom lost her sight, and it's very typical with people with disabilities where somebody wants to help them and they often help them in the wrong way. In her case, they would grab her elbow and start pushing her to help her find where she was going. And she hated it. And she would react very badly. And I used to say, well, they're just trying to help you and you need to try to recognize that. But much like that person with disabilities that's being approached the wrong way, I think one of the other examples we heard was about people who are Black and hair, because hair tends to be a big thing. You can go up and say, I'm really fascinated. Where did you have it done? But you need to be careful. So it's about respecting them and putting it in the context of learning as opposed to judging.
Yeah, and I wouldn't make it my first conversation that I have with them. I would wait until I've gotten to know them a little bit better and, we're out having coffee and, starting to talk about our backgrounds and things. So I'm going to ask that we move along because I'd like to stop recording now. Oh, no, we have one more brainstorming slide. How about if we skip the brainstorming, Ed, and we start playing some of these, playing with some of the cases since we're at 6:10.
Fair enough. As we get set up for that, let me just mention one thing, and it's the cost of unconscious bias. A bunch of different things, and it all comes back to cognitive diversity, the positives that occur when you put together a diverse group of people. When you don't have that, you lose innovation and creativity. You lose profitability. For people with disabilities alone, there's over $1 trillion across the globe with people that have disabilities or are involved in them. You engage them, you care about them, you're authentic with them, and you're gaining that market. You do the microaggressions, the unconscious biases, and you're losing that whole thing. So the losses are dramatic when you don't engage this. And the cost of it is, the cost on the other side is a little bit of discomfort and getting used to interacting with each other. So
Yeah,
we can switch
some of
over.
some of those mistakes can be really costly. Remember the Chevy Nova that they tried to market in South America, and Nova in Spanish means no go. So they certainly didn't have any diversity of thinking when they marketed that car down there.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.